15 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense DST units I would drop this week. The first one, the Los Angeles Chargers. So the Chargers, like I mentioned, were a 1-week pickup on the wire for fantasy owners. In the last 2 out of 3 games, I've known they produced and played well. Week 12 at Denver, 22 points allowed, a sack in it though. Week 13 at the Cincinnati Bengals, 22 points allowed, 6 sacks, 2 those 2 fumble recoveries with a touchdown on one. And then week 14 versus the Giants, 21 points allowed, 2 sacks, and though a fumble recovery. So right here, week 15, very tough matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs. That over the last 5-6 weeks of the season here, they're starting to get things going. They're starting to click. And they give up the 11th least amount of fantasy points to defenses on the season. So right here in a playoff spot for fantasy owners, there's no way I could trust the Los Angeles Chargers here. This is going to be a shootout, in my opinion, on Thursday Night Football. Indoor game, fast-tracked, 2 high-powered offenses. And there's no way I'm going to play the Chargers in this one. So right now, they're owned in 70% of fantasy leagues. Well, right here, they could go back down into the waiver wire for the most part. They're definitely usable in week 16 and 17 at Houston and Denver. But I'm not going to stash Chargers here and use this bench spot, especially if you're in the playoffs, win-or-go-home type of situation. So right here, for this week, they're definitely a defense I would drop. The next defense is the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks were in the same type of situation in week 14, where they were a 1-week use at the defensive position for fantasy owners at the Houston Texans. So the last few weeks here, they've been serviceable, though, is Seattle. Week 12 versus Washington, 17 points allowed, sack, interception, a block kick. Week 13 versus San Francisco, 23 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, and a fake punt for a touchdown. And week 14 at Houston, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks in that one. But week 15 at a high-powered Los Angeles Ram offense that gives up the least amount of fantasy points to defenses. There's no way I'm going to trust them. This Ram team, I think, is going to have a field day anyway versus the Seattle Seahawks team. The Seattle Seahawks team really can't stop anyone. Jamal Adams is out for the year. They're star safety. And they're 5-8 on the season, pretty much going nowhere. So I think the Rams have a field day versus this defense. And there's no way they're usable in a playoff game in fantasy at the Rams. And they're droppable this week. And the third and final defense I would drop is the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints here, mediocre defense this season here for the Saints. They really haven't done much besides that plus matchup at the Jets in week 14. The last couple weeks, I know tough matchups. Week 12 versus Buffalo, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 those. Week 13 versus the Cowboys, 21 points allowed, a sack in it though. And then week 14 at the Jets, a good ball game. 9 points allowed, 3 sacks in that one, and got the victory, obviously. But right here, toughest of tough matchups here, week 15 at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that give up the least amount of fantasy points to defenses. Tom Brady still on another level at 45 years old here. And you just can't trust the Saints, especially in a playoff game for fantasy owners. So right here, their percentage is going to go way down, is New Orleans. Even though they're owned right now in New Orleans, 77% of fantasy leagues. It wouldn't be surprising to me if they dropped in at least 30 or 40% of leagues. And their defense to drop this week, so that's a few defense special team units I would drop here for week 15 of the fantasy football season.